about sprawl, but we're talking about sprawl within a climate crisis. So in this context of the climate crisis, we know the decisions we make matter for the future. And one of the things when we talk about sprawl and the intersection with the climate crisis is this idea of locking in future emissions. So when we build expansive suburbs that are not very dense, way out in rural lands or way out on prime farmland, it's not just that we're destroying habitats, it's not just that we're not using agricultural land for its primary use, but it's also that we're using all of these carbon intensive construction materials, locking in emissions and just an inefficient way to build. And then the people who live there, where you live really impacts your life. I get to live in downtown Dundas and I'm very lucky and I can walk most of the places. When I can't walk somewhere, I can rely on public transit. But if you're out in the country or you're kind of very far off a public transit line, you're car dependent. Where's your grocery store? Really the types of kind of life and the technologies that you're required to use to kind of sustain that life really do lock in an impact. So when our city's making these decisions and they've decided that we're in a climate crisis, that's really the context with which we should be talking about sprawl. Although I'm going to throw this over to Linda in a second, and I think she'll tell us that, despite that's the fact that that's kind of the language we as people who live in the city want to use to talk about the context we're in, that's not necessarily the language we're hearing from our city. So I'm excited to kind of throw things over to Dr. Linda Lukasik from Environment Hamilton.
Thanks so much, Alex. And hi, everyone. So glad that you've come out tonight to hear our story of sprawl. I think it's better described almost as a saga now. So I wanted to give you a little bit of Hamilton history because sprawl, urban sprawl, like expanding outward into rural areas of Hamilton is not a new thing. And I want to share this context because right now we've really identified the provincial government and its policies as kind of being the villain in the story, but we have a problem municipal history too. So just some very quick context. Back in 2006, we saw a city council direction to bookmark an area called Elfrida, rural Elfrida, mainly prime agricultural land. And you'll hear me talk more about that in a minute, as the city's preferred location for urban expansion. And that was around the time that we had a massive boundary expansion for employment land around the airport, originally referred to as the Aerotropolis, and the city stopped calling it that. They now refer to it as the Airport Employment Growth District. So that expansion happened, but they weren't able to justify the residential expansion. And around the same time that this was happening, the former provincial Liberal government was bringing in the Places to Grow Act and a growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, along with the Greenbelt Act and the Greenbelt Plan. So they work sort of in tandem, right? It's this whole idea of that recognition that we needed to curb that sprawl right across the Greater Golden Horseshoe, that area from Peterborough all the way around to Niagara, while at the same time paying attention to starting to protect agricultural land in Southern Ontario because we know it's good quality and we've had this long history of losing it too much to sprawling residential subdivisions. Next slide, please. So fast forward to now, and we have this challenge with a provincial government that's really trying to undo all of the positive policies that we were seeing around regional level growth and control of sprawl. So this is just a highlight slide so that you understand what we're facing right now. We have a provincial government that has facilitated changes in the growth plan that allow private urban boundary expansions up to 40 hectares, or the size of a farm in size. And prior to that, only municipalities could initiate urban boundary expansions. So private developers can ask for these, municipalities can refuse them, but this really is a sort of a change in the process that makes it more convoluted. This provincial government has lowered urban intensification and density targets. So density targets are sort of suburban targets measured in jobs and people per hectare. And then the urban intensification refers to the percentage of residential units that are added to the already built up urban area. So those targets have been lowered. In other words, more sprawling, less dense development is allowed now as a minimum, where we were heading in a direction where those numbers were being increased to make more efficient use of urban land. The Ford government has also expanded the planning horizon out to the year 2051. So municipalities must now plan to accommodate population and jobs growth projections out 30 years into the future. And this is a crazy long period of time, and it's very difficult for anyone to plan in any reliable way out that far. I mean, just think about the past couple of years and what we've dealt with the pandemic. Nobody could have predicted the kinds of changes we would see. So it's crazy to project out that long and to have to accommodate growth projections out that long. Many of us have described this expanded planning horizon as constituting a land grab, so pressuring municipalities to plan to accommodate that much growth, but forcing municipalities to bring all that land into the urban boundary now. So again, not a good approach. The Ford government has also modified the land needs assessment methodology, and my next slide explains to you what that is. They've reinstated market demand as a driving force for determining land needs. So if you imagine, the assumption is usually that people want single family and semi-detached homes, and those use up a lot more land. When prior to that, the methodology really focused on density and intensification targets and planning and assessing land needs based on those more ambitious and more efficient ways to use urban land. So just very quickly, so that you know, a land needs assessment is a technical study that determines how much land is needed to accommodate growth. And it must be completed based on that provincial methodology. And as I say, the Ford government has tinkered with that to make market force a driving piece in how that is done. It's a required part of a municipality's municipal comprehensive review, or MCR, and that's another acronym you'll see thrown around a lot. And a little bit further along tonight, I'm going to run you through the MCR and what that means. Next slide, please. So after seeing these changes, the municipality prepared and presented a draft land needs assessment to council. Planning staff did in December, based on this new land needs assessment methodology. And when we saw the draft, it really made us start to think, will sprawl take it all? And that's the question that we started asking at Environment Hamilton. Next slide, please. And this is just a snapshot of the summary of what city planning staff came up with in their draft land needs assessment. And we had good reason to be concerned. And there's a lot of information on this page, but just very quickly so that you can see, if you look at the left-hand side, there are land needs assessment findings, and staff set out 4 intensification scenarios to consider. And some of them right away, they said, with current trends of intensification, we would need more land than we have to expand into. And they started to look at different scenarios, and ultimately they landed on what they describe as an ambitious density proposal. But I want to tell you, I mean, it's questionable, the ambitiousness of the proposal, because it would still consume an additional 1,340 hectares of rural land. That's 3,300 acres. And you'll see, if you look to the right, planning staff have, right from the time they presented this draft, have been telling people that no urban boundary expansion is not an option. And a lot of us have been, a growing number of us have been pushing back and arguing we need to be more creative. As Alex pointed out, we're now at the start of a decade that's a critical decade for addressing the climate emergency, and we need to get creative. We need to figure out how to do things differently. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of the entire municipality, and I wanted to share this quickly so that you could see we've got Greenbelt in green, and the purple is specialty crop tender fruit lands, which is also Greenbelt, and then the gray area is urban Hamilton, and the white is White Belt land. And you'll hear us refer to White Belt, but it's basically rural land wedged between urban Hamilton and the Greenbelt. And right now, with the city's land needs assessment, it's fair to say that even the ambitious density plan would consume pretty much all of the available developable White Belt land that we have left. Next slide, please. Back to Elfrida. And Elfrida, I told you, the city's been eyeing since 2006 and earlier for urban expansion. But here's the problem. We're in a climate crisis. I think it's fair to say that more and more food security is going to be top of mind for all of us as we hear more about wildfires in California and droughts in other parts of the world we're not going to be able to depend on food coming in from outside. This is a Lear map, and it shows you based on the green coloring. The darker the green, the better the quality of the farmland. So we know, and farmers have already told us this, that this area outlined in red is prime agricultural land. And this is the biggest portion of the urban area that planners are proposing we build more houses on. So of course, you know, this is a huge concern. It's something we all need to be aware of, and we all need to be asking questions about. Next slide, please. All right, so during January and February, as Environment Hamilton, we did a couple of webinars. We started to do work to really reach out to people and talk about the land needs assessment and why it was so important that people pay attention. Nancy Hurst, who's here tonight, is going to share more about the grassroots effort that has bubbled to the surface in an incredible way. But there was a whole lot of work done over January, February, leading up to March 29th to really get community members engaged, to make them aware of the situation, and to mobilize them to join us at that March 29th meeting, either through delegating, through a spoken or pre-recorded delegation, or through writing a delegation. And you can see from this slide, we had great success in getting a whole lot of people engaged. So we had at that meeting over 50 spoken delegations, over 145 written delegations. And then in the lead up to that meeting, many people reached out to their ward councillor, emailed the mayor to let them know that they didn't like the idea of urban expansion. They wanted to see a firm urban boundary as we struggle with the climate crisis. So here's what happened. That was a meeting where city planning staff were hoping that council would approve that ambitious density plan with a 3,300 acre expansion out into rural Hamilton. That decision was delayed, and we had several motions that were brought forward at that meeting by Councillor Brad Clark. One was a motion to the provincial government asking for more time for Hamilton to work through this process of figuring out how to accommodate growth out 30 years into the future, with the argument being that during the pandemic, it's really difficult to bring people together and effectively engage in conversation about such an important issue. The second motion from Councillor Clark called for a survey to be mailed to every single household so people could let the city know how they feel about urban expansion. And that survey would not only include the staff recommended option, the ambitious density and 3,300 hectare expansion, but it would also include the no boundary expansion option, and it would give people room to respond and provide their perspective on what they think should happen if it isn't one of those two. So next slide, please. So just very quickly, and if you could just click again. This is what we achieved. We stopped that decision. Councillor Clark's motions were both passed. And next slide, please. And you know, that includes now, here's some media coverage of the fact that this survey is going to be going out to everyone. I know Nancy's going to speak about that in more detail. Next slide. And I just want to talk about this a little bit. We've had great support from local media, some really good editorials from The Spectator. And this is the editorial that appeared, oh, if you just go back, yep, appeared right after the March 29th delegations. And what I really love about this is it recognizes that what's happening in Hamilton is also happening in other greater Golden Horseshoe municipalities. So like us, there are people in other municipalities who are learning about the issue, who are pushing back because the same kinds of threats are unfolding in other greater Golden Horseshoe municipalities. So I think we all need to think about that as we work away. And there's solidarity in Hamilton that's growing around this issue. And it extends beyond our own community to lots of other communities in Southern Ontario. So bear that in mind, you know, as we all plug away. And I would add there are some great initiatives that have emerged. Environmental Defence has a great effort called Ontario Yours to Protect that brings together a whole network of organizations. And we're all doing our best to support each other as we go. So I'm going to stop there and let you move on to chapter 2.
Thank you, Linda. Now we're going to have Nancy Hurst share some information, and she is with Stop Sprawl Hamont.
Hi, Zoe. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me tonight. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so hi, I'm Nancy, and I am from Stop Sprawl Hamont, which is a name we cooked up in about 4 seconds when we were making our Facebook page. We are a grassroots group of concerned citizens from all across the lower and the upper city, and we've come together with the common goal of stopping Hamilton's proposed urban boundary expansion. I wasn't really familiar with the term sprawl until I attended Environment in Hamilton and Dr. Lukasik, who just spoke about it, the Will Sprawl Take It All seminar. And I learned at that point that urban sprawl, suburban sprawl, and just plain sprawl are all one and the same. Essentially, it's a land grab to convert rural land to urban uses. Next slide, please, Zoe. So the areas in white here, except for the airport, are the farmland at risk of being paved over for subdivisions, and well, the warehouse area is actually all around the airport. That's all kind of done for now. But the white areas are what's at risk here. A few of us have gotten pretty steamed when we heard that the city wants 84% of these areas, which accounts for, as Dr. Lukasik just said, 3,300 acres, which are currently farmland, habitat, and wetlands. And unfortunately, we too often treat soil like dirt, and in actuality, it's a precious and finite resource. It's a living organism, and it's formed over centuries. Plants only grow in topsoil, and it's estimated that we have 60 years of topsoil left, and that 70% of it is gone due to erosion and runoff and degradation. And for what? Next slide, please. For McMansions that most of us can't afford. And don't believe it when developers tell you that more housing supply will bring down prices, because that's their favorite refrain. But with the exception of a few, most developers don't actually concern themselves with affordable housing. Next slide, please. This is another form of sprawl. In Hamilton, a huge chunk of the mountain, which Linda already referred to as the Aerotropolis or the airport lands on the mountain, is farmland around our tiny little airport, which has been rezoned as industrial, and which is now a go-ahead for more warehouses paving over more precious soil. And they say it's for jobs, but with automation, just how many jobs will be provided by these gigantic structures? That remains to be seen. Next slide, please. As you can see from this, Hamilton has plenty of underutilized space to develop. These are surface parking lots, and they're in a 10-block span of our downtown. You can see Copps Coliseum in the top left there. They represent an abundance of places to both develop for housing or depave for green space. And there are many examples of cities which have constructed like multi-level car parks, like Victoria is one. If you want to visit downtown Victoria, which is a really awesome, walkable, wonderful place, you park yourself in the multi-story car park, and then you get out of your car and you walk around and enjoy all the pedestrian zones. And that's maybe what we could do here in Hamilton. Next slide, please, Zoe. Sorry. These slides here, they're just 3 slides of which we can zoom through, but they're just a really great example of how underutilized our city is. These are taken in Kenilworth, Barton, you know, the parts of the lower city which are really just empty. And I think that we really could absolutely say with confidence to our city council that we have plenty of space to develop within our city between all those empty parking lots and the miles and miles and miles of single level strip malls. And I'm not even sure what this building actually is, but it's certainly closed and boarded up. Let's revitalize our lower city and the areas that really need some injection of funds before we start expanding onto greenfields. Next slide, please, Zoe. So in early June, the City of Hamilton will be mailing out, as Linda just said, each household a survey asking how we want to accommodate growth for our city. And we are not too sure how they are going to word this survey, although we have all been trying our best to get the information out of city staff. But there should be probably 3 choices. One will be something like, as was mentioned earlier, an ambitious density plan, which really is just a major sprawl plan with a comforting spin sound to it. And the second, hopefully, will be something like a no boundary expansion option, which, heads up, that's the right choice. And I think there'll be a third option, which is write a choice of your own. And we're going to encourage people to use this space to explain why they chose the no boundary expansion option. And we're also going to be asking that when you fill out the survey and you return it, would you please write to your councillor and tell them what your choice was so that they know that people in their ward are on our side. We also ask that every citizen in the city obtain their own copy because I think only one will be mailed to each household. So everybody's entitled to fill one out and return it so that all of us have a voice, and extras should be available. We're not sure where yet. Libraries were mentioned, but it should be indicated on the survey where and how to get them. Perhaps they'll even be photocopyable. Next slide, please, Zoe. Another great reason to freeze the boundary is to halt our current infrastructure deficit. We are currently $3.8 billion behind in infrastructure maintenance in our city, and we're going in the hole by an extra 20 million a year. So let's not build more expensive infrastructure, which the taxpayer, us, will be left to deal with the maintenance of, but rather let's fix what we have and utilize it within our already existing city. Next slide, please. And as it was touched on earlier, affordable housing doesn't happen in subdivisions. It happens with thoughtful infill and missing middle density with developers who care to build it. And that's usually happening within our current urban boundary. Next slide, please. And finally, oh, no, there's one more. And now climate change. Land use planning is the key lever that municipalities have to either lock in or lock out emissions. The ramifications of land use decisions last for between 30 and 1,000 years, and they're really not easy to undo. So our choices now will be something that we've got to live with for the next 1,000 years if our world is still around at that point. Next slide, please. And finally, transportation, a hot topic in Hamilton these days. But in order to support a decent regular bus system, just bus system, a density of 80 people and jobs per hectare is needed. And just to give you an example of why the bus in my area is so infrequent, urban Ancaster has 20 people and jobs per hectare, nowhere near 80 that is needed. And it's certainly not enough people to support a decent transit. And it locks me in as a taxi mom, since a bus that runs once an hour is not a viable option for getting my kid to work. Next slide, please, Zoe. So thank you for listening, and please have a look at our different social media offerings. You can find us at ssho.ca. That's our website. We have a Facebook page, which is Stop Sprawl Hamont, and we have Instagram, stop_sprawl_Hamilton, and we would love to hear from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. We appreciate you taking your time and sharing this information with us. As we move to chapter 3, just a reminder, if people could check that they are on mute. And Linda Lukasik is going to continue the story of Sprawl.
Thanks, Zoe. So I hope you're all getting a good sense of the narrative here, and it's an important one. And this is really all about all of us coming together and working to build a sustainable, climate resilient, inclusive Hamilton. And if we get it right, it could be amazing. So I'm going to share some nuts and bolts. Next slide, please. And partly because, and you've probably noticed this, any of you who are starting to pay attention to this issue will know that there are all kinds of crazy acronyms that get thrown around all the time. And oftentimes the planners involved forget that, you know, the rest of us don't think in terms of these acronyms. So I wanted to share some of the main ones with you, just so that you get a sense of what this is all about. So we've talked about the land needs assessment, or LNA as the planners like to call it, and that happens within a larger umbrella process referred to as a municipal comprehensive review, or MCR. And right now, all of those municipalities around the Greater Golden Horseshoe, including Hamilton, are going through this MCR process. And I've pulled this off of the Environmental Defense, and many of you will know that organization, great national environmental org. They've been doing a lot of work in Ontario, helping and supporting all of us. And they've got a really great online toolkit. So I'd really recommend that you check that out online. I've provided the link below. It's like a smart growth toolkit that you can work through. So that's where I've pulled this description, because I really liked it just in terms of helping you to visualize MCR. So the MCR process is part of an official plan review. And an official plan, if you don't know what that is basically the blueprints for how a municipality is how it's set up and how it's going to evolve. So in Hamilton, we have a rural official plan and an urban one. To simplify, as far as MCR, Environmental Defense suggests that you think of it as a growth management puzzle. And I love puzzles. So this helped me. You imagine a puzzle. And if you're like me, you always do the outline first. You find all those edges and put them together. So the frame of the puzzle is the urban boundary. And between the frame, there are pieces to fit together to create communities with housing, transit, schools, jobs, and green space. The MCR process takes the forecasted growth for a municipality. So that would be population projections and job projections that the province provides that municipalities have to plan for, and figures out how and where new development can best fit in a municipality. Now, this is Environmental Defense describing this. So when you read this, it suggests that, and what we would agree with, the ideal that you want to accommodate all of those that population growth and those new jobs within the existing urban boundary. Next slide, please. And there are key pieces of that umbrella MCR process. And one of them is calculating the land budget. So this takes us right back to that land needs assessment that I talked about earlier. And again, it's all about determining how much new land is going to be needed to accommodate people and jobs. And right here, I'm going to pause and get you to think about what might influence how you could accommodate people and jobs. And one of the really important things to think about is housing form. So if you have a whole lot of single family homes on large lots, that's going to require a whole lot more land. Whereas if you had single families on smaller lots or semi-detached homes, or you started to think about other creative ways to use land more efficiently, you're not going to need as much. Or think about demographic shifts and what kinds of assumptions are made when you're assessing your land budget when it comes to those kinds of shifts. And I guess what we're all learning as we dig deeper into this process is that in many respects, that land needs assessment is a very subjective process, and it's open to question. And a lot of what many of us are working on right now is challenging the assumptions that the city and its consultants have made around what they're feeding into that calculation of that land budget through the land needs assessment. So the other key piece in the municipal comprehensive review is identifying where to expand urban boundaries if needed. So again, the key first step is that land needs assessment, that land budget. And then once you've figured that out, and again, it's critical what gets fed into it, that's going to determine how the growth will unfold. And then just to make things more complicated, in Hamilton, our planners have come up with Hamilton specific acronyms. So you've probably seen reference, and the city uses this in all of their advertising, I think just to make us all have no idea what the process is about. They refer to it as GRIDS 2 MCR. So GRIDS stands for Growth Related Integrated Development Strategy. And it's GRIDS 2 because the city has gone through this process once before in the past. And they did a GRIDS process when the Aerotropolis expansion happens. So just for some explanation there so that you understand what GRIDS is, it's a big picture planning process that evaluates land use, infrastructure, economic development, and financial implications of growth. And in this case, with GRIDS 2, that's being done for the next 30 years to comply with that provincial planning horizon that I mentioned earlier. And then again here for GRIDS, as planning staff have pointed out, city is planning for quite a few new residents and as many as 122,000 new jobs out to 2051. again, important to note that once those numbers are set by the province, a municipality must plan to accommodate them. And there's also debate out there about the numbers and the legitimacy of the numbers. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to give you just a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of those core acronyms, but I also wanted to take a little bit of time tonight to encourage you to take some action. Right now, the municipality is consulting on what are called a land evaluation framework and phasing criteria. And you'll see my little picture down below that shows the cart before the horse. And the reason why I've put that there is that despite the fact that on March the 29th, we successfully stopped the council from making a decision to support the staff recommendation to expand the urban boundary by 3,300 acres. So that delay has happened, and they're now coming back and asking all of us what we think should happen through the survey. Despite that, staff are moving ahead with a public consultation on an evaluation framework and phasing criteria that assume that expansion into rural Hamilton is going to happen. So they're asking us about two things. The first is a focus on white belt land. So you remember that map, I showed sort of bigger picture, and Nancy zoomed right in to show you those rural white belt lands that may get gobbled up by urban expansion. They're asking us to help them with determining where to grow, how to stage the expansion out into white belt lands, and when. So a phasing analysis, but also evaluating different areas using a series of criteria. So, and at the same time, they are also asking us about Greenbelt towns and villages. And this one to me they're both controversial, but the Greenbelt towns and villages is particularly controversial, I think, because right now the provincial Greenbelt plan does allow for 10-hectare expansions from Greenbelt towns and villages out into protected Greenbelt land. And in Hamilton, we have two areas, Waterdown and Binbrook, that would qualify. So the planning staff are asking us, what do we think about that? And how should we evaluate if we make a decision to go in that direction? We're saying that it's crazy that we're even contemplating going in that direction. There's absolutely no need for us to be talking about expansion of urban areas into the Greenbelt. The deadline to comment is May the 31st. And I know this is very convoluted, so we have pulled together a detailed action sheet that we're going to pass along to Zoe and Alex at Action 13 so they can email that out to you. It'll provide you with step-by-step instructions on how you can prepare and submit comments. Next slide. But I just want you to see, in terms of the evaluation criteria that the city is asking for feedback on, this is the list of criteria, and it's a very comprehensive list. So one of the really core messages that we're trying to communicate about this particular consultation that assumes that expansion is going to happen is that all of these criteria are criteria that we should be applying now at this point in time when we're making that very fundamental decision around whether to expand or not. So this list will be really helpful, I think, for all of us as we provide feedback on the survey. If you look at this issue from a climate change point of view, you've heard what Nancy has said, you've heard what Alex has said. It makes a whole lot of sense that expanding outwards is not going to help us to tackle the climate emergency. Municipal financing, we know sprawl never pays for itself. You can walk through this whole list and see why a framework like this really does not support outward expansion. So if you're willing to take a little bit of time before May 31st, you could even send that message to planning staff that we shouldn't be talking about a framework for assessing those expanded areas. We should be applying this framework to that core decision about whether expanding out makes sense in the first place. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that. We're going to jump into some questions. We do already have a few there, but I just want to thank Linda and Nancy so much. Like, one of the things we really want to underscore tonight with this idea of like a story of sprawl is that for months now across Hamilton in different communities, people have been jumping on Zoom calls. They've been coming together. They've been delegating to City Hall to kind of intervene on this process. And as this keeps going on, we need more and more people to keep engaging I think the city, Linda, you said this, but I think the city was a little awestruck when, what was it, like close to 100 folks came out to delegate to say, hey, this doesn't make sense. What are you doing? And in favor of the survey happenings. And so now, because so many folks have been getting involved, we have this survey. But as you're saying, Linda, despite having this survey coming out, there's already, the city's still thinking about expanding on their website before they've even heard from us. So it's really important that folks get engaged. We'll send out an action sheet. We'll send out this recording. So it's a great chance to kind of think about 3 or 4 people in your life who, when you're kind of writing your feedback for these 2 kind of engagement pieces, who are you going to kind of bring into the sprawl story? Who are the characters that kind of need to join? So yeah, I think we have had quite a few questions throughout. So I'm going to start with those as we kind of go in. And then if at any point folks want to kind of raise their hand or type a question into the chat, we can do that too. One of the questions that we got earlier, Linda, and I think this is a good one for you, is could you just talk a little bit about, so once those lands, if they unfortunately are deemed urban and they're brought into the urban boundary, who do we think owns some of them? And kind of, I've heard you say the phrase gambling before. Could you kind of explain that ownership and
Yes.
what
Yeah.
that land grab looks like?
So I always like to say land speculation is a gamble and there are no guarantees. And so what we've struggled with in Ontario, and this is something that happens in urban areas around North America, and it's not a good thing. And it's that idea that land on the edge of urban areas gets scooped up by people who are just waiting for that urban area to expand outwards. So land speculators, developers scoop up that land and they wait. And overnight, if that land is brought into the urban boundary, the value of that land increases astronomically as soon as that happens. So we end up with these scenarios, and Elfrida is a good example where even right now, most of that land, that prime agricultural land in Elfrida, is already in the hands of private developers. And you'll recognize, some of the names. There are local home builders in the area who already own big parcels of land there, and they're waiting to move forward with that. But here's the thing, and this is what I think is really important for us to think about right now. Any of us who are paying attention to that existential threat called the climate crisis, we know that this decade, this time frame from now out 10 years into the future is critical. And if we don't take decisive action, we're going to be in big trouble. So here's what I would say. Land speculators are gambling and scooping up that land. We're all coming together and pushing for the common good and pushing for what we need to build a climate resilient future for Hamilton and beyond, right? And a critical piece right now is protecting as much prime agricultural land as we can and figuring out how to build our cities differently to get the density in Nancy's neighborhood up so that her daughter can take the bus to work because the service will be better, as one example. So we need to make that shift. We should have made that shift a long time ago. In terms of moving away from allowing this process on the edges to continue to happen in the way that it has historically. Now's our time to save more farmland for the good of everyone, rather than heading in that direction of a few people making huge profit to build homes that likely are really not going to help us to solve the housing crisis, are only going to create more challenges for the municipality. So that's a long-winded way for me to say, that situation that we're in right now, we could stop it. We just need to make the right decisions here.
Yeah, thank you for that, Linda. I know before this sprawl issue happened, I didn't know, and I think a lot of folks on this call probably don't know, that so much of our, that land kind of outside the city limit, we just assume that the people who live there own it or things like that, but that's not always the case. Much like in a city, a lot of that's kind of maybe rented to its current use and is owned by someone waiting to cash out. 3 kind of related questions that came in. Again, Linda, I think mostly in your direction, are just kind of the, why is the province, like how does the province come to this? Maybe speaking about the contestation in the provinces of Places to Grow Act and what they do, and maybe some of the controversy surrounding, because a lot of folks have kind of been asking, well, these provincial projections seem to not make sense. Why is the province doing this? And then also, why is the city kind of recommending this option as well? Even though like, the city staff have to work in this provincial framework, but why are they choosing to work in it this way?
Yeah, so why is the provincial government doing this? My goodness, that's the $1 million question. And Nancy may want to weigh in on this one too. I think it's obvious. I mean, you've all been following what's happening in the media with MZOs and, you know, Conservation Authority Act being decimated and all of these crazy changes that are really paving the way for more paving, right? And it's short-sighted, and the people who are benefiting the most are the people who are used to the sort of traditional approach to community development. And I think I think it's heartbreaking to think that at this critical time, and I'm going to say it this way, this critical time in human history and our history on this planet, that we've shifted in this direction, because we were heading in the right direction with these policies and where they were taking us. They needed to be even more stringent, but a good foundation had been built by the previous provincial government. So I'm going to say, you know, the cynical me says this is all about this government facilitating the ability of their pals in the development industry to make a whole lot of money. And you're seeing that too with these highway proposals, you know, highways that we don't need, that will only open more areas to more sprawl. So I'm gonna call it what it is. And the challenge we're facing now is that because we've seen policy changes like the ones that I have described that have been made to the Places to Grow plan, act and the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, they now leave us in a situation where our municipal planners say, well, our job is to make sure that the municipality conforms with those provincial planning requirements, those policy requirements. So, you know, in my ideal world, we would have municipal planners revolting too, because really these changes, many of them constitute poor planning policy. You know, if there is really a commitment and a desire to build climate resilient communities. So I think it leaves me feeling that what needs to happen is exactly what we're all doing. We need to be mobilizing. Alex, I like the way that you put it. People need to be talking to family and friends and helping them to understand that if we don't all speak up, nobody else is going to step up for us, or we're going to have to pressure them to step up. So that's where we find ourselves. You know, municipalities feeling pressured, you know, planning staff feeling pressured to comply with the requirements that are in front of them and to ensure that the municipality achieves that compliance. But, you know, I think we all need to feel comfortable saying, this is BS, this is garbage, and it's not going to take us in the direction that we need to go in.
Thanks, Linda, for the details on trying to give us some insight on what the province might be thinking. We have a question also from Cheryl. Cheryl, if you are able to unmute, then you can ask your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I'm a retired faculty member from McMaster University, and whenever anyone starts talking about surveys, my antennas start waving because I want more details about the methods and methodology that have been used so that I can understand the purpose of the survey, how it's going to be constructed, and how the findings are going to be interpreted and to what use the results are going to be put. For example, is there going to be any kind of way of tracking the responses from the participants so that we get a sense of how people who live in certain parts of the city might feel about this urban expansion that we're talking about? So that's one of my questions. And tied in with that coding, is there going to be any follow-up to people after the surveys have been returned, or perhaps to target areas of the city where responses have been not that frequent? Okay, and I think I had one other question about the just how they're going to track the demographics of the participants. So thank you.
Nancy, did you want to jump in and start? I know you've been thinking a lot about the survey. I don't think we have a lot of answers, but
That's
we
the
certainly
thing.
have thoughts. Yeah.
The answer, Cheryl, is who knows? The city staff isn't telling us anything. We have actually reached out and asked multiple questions. We've asked to be part of the process in constructing the survey even. And it seems to be just a big secret. And recently, when the city reached out again to citizens to ask what do you think about the grids 2 process, about where, which is what Linda was just saying, where the cart went before the horse, where do you want to expand into green fields? Sort of ignoring the fact that there's a survey coming. They had a little blurb right there that said, oh, by the way, a zero boundary expansion option really isn't an option. So they're really, I wouldn't even doubt it if they put it on the survey. You can vote for a zero boundary expansion option, but it's not really an option. So we really don't know what the survey is going to say. We don't know if it's going to be copyable. We don't know if it's going to be, tracked electronically. And despite questions, we're not really getting much from the city. So the answers to your questions are, to my mind, unknown at the moment. Maybe Linda can shed a bit more light.
Yeah, I'm hoping there'll be at least be a spot for you to put your name and your address so that they can track to that level. But I know there's also concern because the survey is in the hands of city planning staff, as far as we understand, to prepare and to get out there. And as Nancy is pointing out, they made a decision early on in the process not even to assess the firm urban boundary because they concluded that that was not a viable option. So I think we're all very fearful of what kinds of explanations, if any, in the way of background information are going to be provided with this survey, and how might that influence the way people are going to respond. So right now, we know nothing about how it's going to look, but I think we're all fearful about how it might look.
And therefore, if it's structured towards getting the responses that they want, as compared to the actual thoughts from Hamiltonians, that always causes me some concern.
Yeah.
So thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate it.
Do we have other questions in the chat? If some folks want to kind of indicate or maybe raise their hand using the Zoom function. I kind of have a question which goes into what I think Katie put in the chat for Linda, or Nancy, I think anyone who can answer it, which is just how many, given that this is the single largest source of carbon emissions being locked in. And yeah, Kathleen Livingston asking, do councillors not have a say in the survey? I guess my question is, Linda, Nancy, how many councillors have hosted public information sessions on sprawl? What are our city officials doing to engage us on this pivotal climate issue?
Well, I can say a couple of words about that because concurrently with the grids to expand our urban boundary process is running, as Mr. McLean here knows full well, the CEEP, the Community Energy and Emissions Program, which is a program that was brought about after Hamilton declared a climate emergency to start identifying ways in which our city can start reducing our emissions so that we can meet our targets. And it seems that during the pandemic, part of the staff was pulled from the CEEP and moved over to the grids too, so that process could keep marching forward while the energy and emissions plan sort of faltered and fell behind. So a few of us have been wondering, how can you even be considering a boundary expansion if your report is going to come out before the energy and emissions report? Because surely the energy and emissions report should be telling us how much, if any, we should be expanding into greenfields. But that report isn't due until after we've expanded our boundaries. So what the city staff says is, oh, we'll do our big expansion and then we'll look at ways to get really green about it. It's a bit late then. So I don't know if that answers your question, Alex, but I think that although they say they are closely collaborating, they are not, in my view.
Linda, any public information sessions you've been invited to?
No, Alex, I haven't. My ward councillor certainly hasn't held a public information session about sprawl. Maybe I should ask him if he would be willing to do that. I think that would be really helpful. In fact, we're still waiting because one of the commitments coming out of the climate emergency declaration was also for the city to really ramp up community education around climate. So this would be the ideal issue to help people to understand the implications of climate if they understood, that sprawl is just going to make things worse. One other thing that I was going to add, just talking about the community energy and emissions plan, is that the consultant that's doing the work for the city of Hamilton, they also helped the city of Ottawa with their plan. But we also found some really neat analysis the same consultant had done for the city of Edmonton. And I think city of Edmonton did it right, because they empowered the consultant to take a look at different options for urban growth management and to actually evaluate using that community energy and emissions planning process. So Edmonton has a special plan that looks at the different growth scenarios through a climate lens. So it's that sort of what I was talking about earlier. If you actually put the horse after the cart like you should, you really want to do that kind of analysis at the front end, because as Nancy's pointed out, there's that carbon lock-in that happens with urban form that's so problematic. We haven't done that analysis in Hamilton, and it would be fantastic if that was part of that community energy and emissions plan. So, that's something for you to think about, even asking your counselor, have we assessed the different growth options that we're going to be asked about in the survey, looking at them through a climate lens? And I can tell you right now, the answer to that question is no, we haven't.
Well, and thank you for that, Linda. As we're kind of getting to the end, we'll stay on for some more questions, but I just want to, for folks who have to leave at 8, I want to leave us with some action items. And that's kind of why I was asking this question, is because we've seen that at the 31st, we have comments that we can submit on both of those concerning proposals you were talking about, with Greenbelt communities, as well as the just broader, like, how are we growing? And we have chances here to really say, no, we don't want to be growing on white belt lands. We don't want to be having the process to expand onto white belt lands should be non-existent, or at the very least, extremely stringent. So we have the option to submit those comments, and folks will be getting an action sheet following this event to help with those comments. Let folks know that an early June survey is coming. Make sure that you kind of are aware for it. And yeah, make sure that everyone in your household is filling it out. Again, I do really think, like, we're having this as a climate discussion tonight because that's really the frame that the city's been avoiding having it in. And I think that's a lens that it's really, and that's kind of what we were getting at here is, it's been community groups like Environment Hamilton. Environmental Defense, you mentioned earlier, has had, I think, 2,000 to 3,000 people big webinars across Ontario, where folks from across the Golden Horseshoe in the thousands are coming out to say, hey, we care about this issue. And as you mentioned, we in the city of Hamilton are on the front lines. So in doing these follow-ups, which again are making sure you get those comments in by May 31st and watching for the survey in early June, I think one of the other things we've teased out is really building that relationship with your counselor and sending that email today, tomorrow, and saying, this is a huge climate issue. This is a huge, complicated decision. I've attended a webinar put together by citizens. I really appreciated the content I learned, but isn't it your job to be informing me about these huge decisions as well? And I think asking, because it really is important that I think a lot of folks in the chat recently have been talking about what is the responsibility of counselors in doing this survey. And we as citizens really should be filling this out to have our voice heard, but it's not the only way we can have our voice heard. So yeah, I think we have had maybe a few questions in the chat that we can go to after, but I do want to thank everyone for coming out. So some of the partners that were here tonight and where you can find us. Action 13, we're relatively new on the scene in Hamilton, as is Stop Sprawl Hamilton, I guess. But Action 13, we're a Ward 13, so that's Dundas and parts of Flamborough. Is our ward. Arlene Vanderbeek is our city councilor, and we're trying to have climate action conversations on the regular in our community and build some climate action here in our community. Environment Hamilton is a long-standing environmental organization, citizen watchdog, climate advocate in Hamilton. And we've heard from Nancy from Stop Sprawl Hamilton, which is a citizen coalition that's popped up around this issue. And there's so many other folks that have been engaging with this through these 3 kind of organizations outside of these organizations. And now as we kind of end this story of sprawl tonight, the real question becomes, how are you going to become a part of this story? And what's your role going to be?